We began this year with a bunch of episodes on smaller trips around the UK, often in weather less great than we'd like. And I can't lie, it does feel great to be making episodes on Greece again. We have an ever-growing playlist of trips there from the last, it's actually 7 years now. Between our Hillfort series and everything else, we are a little behind. This was actually filmed in 2024. Excuse me. Yes, our backlog does sometimes stretch to 2 years deep, and that's not including our projects we've been adding to for some distant time in the future. I mean, we've been filming Roman sites as far back as 2018, and goodness knows when we'll have made it around the Mediterranean to a sufficient degree to make that series. But since the sites average between 2 to maybe 2,500 years in age, the fact that it's taken us nearly 2 years to cut this together does seem somewhat trivial. So with all this, why are we back in Athens? We were first here in 2018 and then in 2021, twice in fact. So what now? Well, other than a few things close to but outside of Athens, there is a lot here. In 2018, we had a phenomenal time, but I was not filming. And other than a handful of abstract shots, I was actually banking long video blocks for other, it's actually not that interesting. Anyway, it was my usual MO of taking about 2,000 photos. Then when we came back in the summer of 2021, it was a near miracle considering the travel rules at the time, but we actually only had 1 day. We made the most, but not a huge amount. Then returning in the autumn, it was also really just one full day with Sean and Callum, and that then became a 3-parter from all around Athens and the Peloponnese. Thing is, we got massive rainfall in Athens, and a fair amount for the rest of the country too. So it felt rather silly. Here we are, having transited through Athens multiple times, yet only having limited footage that in a lot of cases I wasn't that thrilled with. And it should go without saying, there was still plenty that I hadn't caught around the city. But cannot lie, I'd actually been strangely fortunate. So, despairing at how flights to Greece have shot up precipitously, even in the last 2 to 3 years, I decided I was going to book something in the much cheaper February. And hey, maybe it's fine, maybe it rains, mixture of the two. We'll just have a good time anyway. Maybe if the weather's really bad, this will maybe be a museum trip. But then that flight got cancelled. I don't know if EasyJet still does this, but that meant I had a re-roll of the dice on any other Athens flights at no additional cost. So, July, please? These are flights that can climb to hundreds of pounds as they fall so close to the summer holidays, just gratis, or at least for the under £100 I'd paid for the February round trip. So, not going to pretend that didn't feel pretty great. So it was pretty much guaranteed to be fine, which based on the previous October trip was a relief, so it was time to see how much of ancient Athens I could catch under blue skies. And that seems like a good moment for an intro. So we are Forest Archaic Collective, as well as making jungle drum and bass. We followed ancient sites across Europe and beyond, whether it's Neolithic standing stones, Roman arches or Romanesque churches. If it's ancient, we're into it. Well, this trip didn't have the greatest start. Yeah, people probably only vaguely remember this as a headline now, but does anyone recall the CrowdStrike crash? Well, it hadn't taken out my flight yet, but it had cancelled my overnight coach, and the number of alternatives is, well, it's basically get the train the evening before and wait 5 hours in the terminal and sucks to be you. So yeah, on a ludicrous milk train that dumped me at Gatwick at around 2:30 a.m, well, had a breakfast in the pretty much empty Wagamamas. The flight did take off, that's the main thing, and only 45 minutes waiting on the tarmac. It's like, oh, come on guys, you didn't have to make a special effort just for me. Anyway, having scarcely scored any sleep overnight, and, well, at least no more than the interval between Surbiton and Walton-on-Thames as the train stopped at every station ever built in Surrey, I got a few Zeds on the flight, though again, band-aid on a stab wound, and at length, there it was. You do forget just how much Athens sprawls. It's crazy sprawly. In the previous episodes, there is a detail I had not fully appreciated. On the eve of the Greek War of Independence, Athens was pretty much just a village, or at least a small town, with the Acropolis towering above it. On most of the southern side, for example, the area around was almost empty, and this was true recently enough that we have photographs. And now, it's a city of 3.6 million. During the course of the 20th century, it has seen the most extraordinary expansion as people in their hundreds of thousands moved to the capital. Well, landing in Athens wouldn't need much remarking on, except for that glorious burst of heat that hits you when you exit onto the tarmac. And even just being in the airport at Athens was already bringing back great memories of previous years. Well, metro into the city, quick bit of a walk on foot, and all of a sudden, there it was. The view from Monastiraki Square is one of the more remarkable in the city, at least at ground level. The dual framing of the former mosque with the Acropolis behind, iconic. However, I was still somewhat on the clock. It's always the way, even with an early flight. By the time you've flown, you subtract the time difference, you aren't left with much time on day one, and especially when you factor in the closing times of certain places. And there was at least one major stop I wanted to fit in on this first day or risk missing it entirely. So I quickly dropped in on the hostel I was staying to put my bag down. And yet these episodes really are a case of do as I say rather than as I do, because rather than basking in the highlights of Athens and soaking in all the nostalgia, I immediately went back underground to the metro and headed into a windowless museum. Actually, this wasn't the worst plan, mid-afternoon on a day pushing like 38 degrees. So this is the Museum of Cycladic Art. And I think I might need to tee this one up. So, okay. In some ways, the ancient history of Greece needs no introduction. The white marble Doric columns are pretty much the very first thing people picture when you utter the name Greece. However, these most remarkable temples and monuments are mostly from what's known as classical era Greece. Put a rough pin in just after 500 BC. However, if you go back further, and as anyone who's been on the channel knows, we of course do, you wind back to the Bronze Age and the Mycenaeans. It's the gold, the Cyclopean masonry, it's all the stuff we've been chasing for years, any chances we get. But even before that, if you head over to Crete, the Minoans predated the Mycenaeans and were managing things utterly remarkable for Europe at this time. I really hate having to shoot past all this so briefly, but anyway. So the Minoans, still internationally famous ever since Arthur Evans' rather sensationalised accounts were written up in the newspapers as his dig was ongoing. But contemporary with the Minoans, and in some cases even earlier, there was a culture, or perhaps more nuanced, several cultures, that existed in the Cycladic Islands. And these people, who are afforded none of the fame of classical era Greece, the Mycenaeans or the Minoans, were building major settlements, and we've explored some of these, though we have further to go, whether it's Panormus on Naxos or Skarkos on Eos, or the treasures from Thera. You can catch all of these on previous episodes in the Greek playlist, but one of the things that leaps forth from this ancient culture, something completely unforgettable and thankfully found in significant quantities, these figurines. Now, straight away, these feel like they would sit on your mantelpiece right now in the 21st century. And in fact, this has been a problem for a while. A countless number of these priceless ancient pieces of art have disappeared into private hands. Yet not to excuse that, but I am just grateful for the quantity we still have in public museums. We caught some on Naxos and elsewhere. But this collection is particularly remarkable. It's all very user-friendly and very easy to love. I was definitely that kid who was kind of hyper and didn't have much attention span on the days where we were out and at historic places. But I think even as just a brief visit, anyone could enjoy this. Look, exquisitely crafted, enigmatic figures from 4, even 5,000 years ago. Come on, what could be a better hook than that? You can't get away from the uniformity of design of most of the Cycladic figures, big or small, and some are shockingly big. But there is also a diversity of designs. I won't unpick all of this right now. It gets pretty abstract, all the way out to these violin figurines, which, while still a representation of the human form, are a bit more obscure. As with, just about everything on this channel, this is a work in progress. The absolute cascade of amazingness that will flow forth when we finally break the dam on everything from classical era Greece, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and yes, the Cycladic culture. So, feeling euphoric, I stepped out onto the street to walk unhurriedly back to central Athens. I'd forgotten just how much I missed the sound of cicadas. It is an impossible to miss part of being in southern Europe. This was really the first time outside of the UK in almost a year, what with my son arriving, and I really thought something was going to happen to nix this trip. It was just going to be a short one, but I was finally back. And it's so easy to lose yourself in the Athens botanical gardens. And I'm not being poetic, it's just genuinely hard to find your way around once you've walked a few minutes. You could see the parakeets in the treetops, and this fascinating bird, whatever that is, glanced past the Roman baths of Zapeo, and I think I'd glimpsed these before, but wow, so much more impressive than I remembered. And having not ingested really anything other than water since breakfast at around 4 a.m, it was time to celebrate. I'll admit my rapturous praise for Coffee Island has slightly wound down over the years, partly because my estimation of Greek coffee is even higher now, but also Maybe it's because I was drinking their blends in my home during the lockdowns. It just makes it slightly less of a novelty, but all of this is not to say that this well-earned Fredo did not make me pretty ecstatic. Funny enough, the last time I was sitting here, it was October 2021, and that road was a river. Stopped off for a quick beer. Mythos is not a good lager. Then again, I'd argue that no lager is really a good lager. It's just that there's a few that are truly dire. But when I drink it, I think it sort of hot wires me back to house parties as a teenager. Yeah, this is kind of trash, but then I guess I'm kind of trash too, something like that. But an ice-cold pint for €2.70, this was happy hour pricing, but still, in a capital city, height of summer 2024, that's pretty good. Back home, the pints at Gatwick have probably spiked to a high of about a tenner now. I'll have to check next time I'm in. So from here, I caught a wildcard selection of some of Athens' ruins, just afforded myself the freedom to wander without really having a plan. It was a nice evening, if still oppressively hot. The light on the ruins in a sort of loose circumference of Monastiraki were glowing in the evening sun. On impulse, I decided I need to get up Lysibetus for sunset, and I proceeded to completely underestimate the time required. And even though I was power walking and making myself very red in the face from the considerable slope and stairs, I caught some nice colours over the city, though notably still a few hundred yards short of the summit. But, whatever, I'd just go back. And then walking back, which somehow seemed to take twice as long as the ascent, it was back to the hostel. I was staying at Safe Stay Athens. I don't not want people to be safe where they stay, but that branding makes it sound like there's a sort of series of hall monitors excuse me, no running, and straighten that tie. Well, anyway, it does boast a decent roof bar, and I spent the evening there conversing with strangers, which, as you'll know, often turns out to be one of the highlights of these trips. There were some great people. The people in my room were very amenable. About 11:30, I finally got some shut-eye. But I was up at 6 the next day, so I was not going to be exclusively seeing things in Athens during this handful of days. It was great to be getting more Athens footage and filling in some things I'd never caught before, but I was also using Athens as a jumping off point for some places nearby, one of which was Aegina Island. This is somewhere we'd caught on our first ever trip to Athens, but it's also going to need to be a separate episode just to kind of keep things trim. So definitely look for that the week after this episode goes up. That was an incredible day. Anyway, early start, early boat, great day, then boat back. Got back into Piraeus about 3:30. It was really hot, and I was in a bit of a haze, so there's kind of a gap in my footage here. I was just sort of slowly trundling through the streets. I tried to get reasonably clear of the port area to escape the price gouging, but I ended up paying way too much for a pint anyway. I just needed a toilet and a sit down. I wasn't heading straight back to the centre of Athens. There's a selection of things I wanted to catch around Piraeus. In the ancient city of Athens, the main settlement was around the Acropolis, but then it was linked via the Themistoclean Wall to the port of Piraeus. And the port area, while yes, modern and a bit smoggy as you might expect, does have some ancient sites to see. So I headed for the Archaeological Museum of Piraeus. As I got there, there was something that sounded like an alarm, and as I sort of poked my head round the entrance, I got a very flustered receptionist shouting something approximating like, "Not now!" Which, okay, I don't know if it was a burglar alarm, fire alarm, or whatever, but it's not a good time. Okay, I get it. So I didn't get to see the museum, but I did just see the theatre there. You can kind of catch it through the perimeter fence, just about. And staying in the vicinity, there's some significant archaeology just a couple of blocks away, including Ronchy Square, with some remains largely from the Roman period there, and similarly round the corner. With that, headed back on the metro, and while I was at it, took a better look at the archaeology that makes up part of the Monastiraki metro station. Not surprising, when you put spades in the ground to make a metro, you're going to be hitting archaeology. A lot of archaeology, in fact. Just ask Thessaloniki, which has only just got its metro up and running after the last few decades of delays, and Rome, of course, still hasn't managed to get that metro cut through its most central region for the same reason. And again, I allowed myself to sort of drift between the various ancient churches of Athens and the archaeological points around the city. Now, don't mistake me for being non-committal. Not only was the following day going to be more of an organised shooting schedule, but because I'd filmed a lot of this before, I just wasn't frantically trying to bank hours of footage at this stage. I did need to grab a bite. Now, I don't want to assume that I'm introducing you to the idea of gyros. This is a comparatively well-known form of takeaway. Not only have we had numerous gyros takeaways across our Greece episodes, Hey, I actually got a surprisingly good one in Glasgow this autumn just gone as well. What really marks out is it sits at this low price, basically below any other meal on a menu. It'll vary from place to place, and of course prices have been creeping up since we first started making episodes a few years back, but sub €5 is still very possible, or at least it was when I made this. The irony is, as I'm writing this script, I'm going to be back in Greece, here in 2026 in a couple of weeks, and I'll be back in Athens about 3 weeks after that. So I'll be able to benchmark this again. So these sit at the perfect triangulation point. Greek food is amazing as it is. It makes my heart hurt just thinking about it when I'm not there. This is ludicrously tasty, and it's cheap, and it's both everywhere and a huge nostalgia rush for me. So the first night I got gyros, felt great. I was mostly on the espressos and beers during the daytimes. So second night, hey, I'm not too proud. I'm getting gyros again. Brilliant. Now, while my impulsive effort to head for Lysibetis hadn't quite come together the previous evening, there was no question of where I needed to go on this occasion. So down the main promenade on the southern side of the Acropolis, up the dusty steps to the top of Philippapu Hill, and there's the Acropolis, and there's the sunset. In the background of all these videos, you can kind of hear me quite out of breath from rushing so much as to not miss the sun. There's surprisingly few places around Athens that you can actually get a really good composition of the Acropolis. Of course, a lot of the time you're just at street level and the buildings getting in the way. If you're directly below it, the retaining wall and the rest of the hill kind of screens most of it from view. You do get a good view from Monastiraki, for example. If you're on a rooftop, that's also good, but those are of course all private, so you're either eating or drinking or staying on those. But Philippapu Hill is rightfully celebrated. It's not surprising. There was a large number of people up there. There's ample space. So I stayed up there a while, saw the Philippapu monument again, which was erected here in the early 100s AD. Watched the last tip of the sun disappear behind the distant hills. Seeing the colours out towards Piraeus and watching the lights of dusk starting to come on. It was an amazing time. It felt incredible. And, walked around the paths of the Acropolis. The restaurants around Monastiraki were all rammed by now. It was something of a quieter night at the hostel, which was a bit of a shame. After the high of the sundown, I would have liked some folks to chat to, but this is kind of how it goes. Some evenings there's a lot going on and a lot of folks to chat to. Some evenings, not so much. So, spent some more time on the roof bar in the company of the incredible view. And next morning, so this was a morning of hitting the archaeological parks. As I mentioned, in Greece, Tuesday is basically Sunday. Almost all of the historical sites close for the day. This is why I had to do Aegina on Monday, for example. No Temple of Apollo on Tuesdays. The footfall in Athens is sufficient that pretty much all the main archaeological parks stay open 7 days a week, though the heat warnings might have meant they were closing a bit earlier. Okay, so I hit the Agora first, mainly because I wanted some wide shots of the Temple of Hephaestus without the gaggle of people. The Agora is a little hard to pass as a visitor. It's a lot of ruins at similar heights spread over a large area dotted with trees. If you're up for getting granular, then the signage is good, but I can understand if people don't want to get into that level of detail. That is the way to see it, though. Without the info panels, you're going to struggle to make sense of the assorted ruins. The Temple of Hephaestus is worth the price of admission alone. It's almost certainly the best preserved classical Greek temple anywhere. It's a near miracle. Also, recall from last time, the tortoise is roaming the site slowly. There's a lot here, and I'm not getting into all of it. We're running long as it is. And the next set of sites have... Well, okay, so here's the thing. If you have a heritage site where you can see everything from the fence on pretty much all sides, other than like a few details, maybe a mosaic fragment here or the inside of the Tower of the Winds, for example, I've cut a chunk of the script explaining some of the practicalities. I think I might have to do an episode one day about how you can best catch Athens in a single day. We'll see. Anyway, that's why I'm skimming some of the details. There's a lot more I was catching that isn't, front and center here. So with quite a bit of filming done, I headed past the Arch of Hadrian to the Temple of the Olympian Zeus. Now, especially since it's basically a permanent building site the size of a football pitch, in its current condition, this is both the least rewarding and somehow the busiest site yet. I'm not knocking the ruins, but it looks like someone else has, as they've been scaffolding bound for years now, and you don't get a lot from just being inside the perimeter fence. Okay, granted, there's a little additional archaeology that I was enjoying. I think most people probably don't even register this is here, and you're mainly walking around a very large empty grass plot. And having put my best foot forward to get here, as I exited, I had that feeling of like, woo, okay, I need to be careful. I am feeling a bit lightheaded from just powering through that heat, and especially if the sun was getting higher and the cool of the early morning was long gone. To perhaps better answer the question in the thumbnail, I think people are more and more aware of this, even just in the last 2 or 3 years, as the headlines of heat waves and wildfires hit. We Brits, we spend winter getting all lovesick just for the sight of the sun, and we make playlists of episodes getting all sad and talking in our serious cadence, which is slower, with longer pauses, and more close-mic'd. And then we make self-deprecating jokes about it. But in light of this, we tend to overcorrect by booking trips to southern Europe and beyond in the height of summer. And it's one thing to wish aloud for 40-degree heat on a February day in the UK where it's 14 degrees and cloudy, but that becomes a bit of a monkey's paw when us fragile Brits actually feel the scorching 40-degree sun on our skin for a few minutes and perhaps wisely opt to duck back inside. At this point in this particular July, Athens was doing okay. Sure, hot, definitely not the time to skip out on the sunblock, don't do that, but it can be much more of a problem. When Jen and I were there in 2021, the situation was quite different. In the one day we had, Athens was experiencing heat waves, which are often accompanied by rolling blackouts as AC units run high and the demands of the power grid just take it down entirely. When we took off from Kalamata a few days later, you could see the plumes of smoke rising from the fires in the countryside. It's one of the reasons we weren't up the Acropolis that day, and while we saw a fair amount, it did become a game of leapfrogging from one patch of shade to the other before you end up being out too long and making yourself sick. So back to this trip, and feeling the heat quite acutely in this part of the city with little shade, I headed for the restaurants and took a moment to sit down and, have a cold mid-morning beer. Again, a quite average lager, but just hitting completely different in the circumstances. So yeah, I'm trash, and this felt great. Oh hey, there's that alternative channel name I've been looking for. Then after the beer, it was time for a mini pilgrimage, crossing a part of Athens that took me right back to 2018. I wasn't sure if I recall it, but could even spot the street where we got breakfast one morning, this more modern take on a Byzantine church. This is the coffee place I dream about when I'm in the UK. We stumbled upon this in 2018 by chance, and I've been back every time I've been to Athens. I'm thrilled they're still in business after all this time. It's dive, and it's so good. Just outstandingly made coffee in a great independent spot. I got an espresso and an iced espresso so I could enjoy it in both flavour profiles. Sadly, had to move along, so back across town for the umpteenth time, and it was time for one of the bigger ones. Now, while a lot of Greek history sites are closed on Tuesday, the National Museum kind of does a compromise by just opening at 1 p.m. instead. Even though I was among the first in, it got crazy busy very quickly. I mean, an air-conned building in the heat of the day, not hard to see the pull. And this may be one of the most remarkable museums in the world. I mean, the quality of finds in there from around Greece. I'm excited just thinking about this again. After 90 minutes, I came out and I just really wanted to punch the air. I pretended to stretch instead, but I was absolutely ecstatic. It's been something like 6 years I'd been meaning to see some of the things in here. If you watch the Greece in 5 days, you'll find out the reason I'd not been in previously. Yes, the Mycenaean death masks front and centre as soon as you enter. I'd been dying to see those. The grave goods, which just keep going. The frescoes. There's some amazing Cycladic finds too. I assumed that maybe the collection at the Cycladic Art Museum was so vast that there wouldn't be much here, but there is so much. And even though the Museum of Ancient Theatre on Santorini is just one of the finest anywhere to visit for all the finds from Akrotiri, there was also a couple of them here in Athens. There was the boxing fresco, and for a first time to see the Antikythera mechanism. So look, I know this is mostly quite niche, like Bronze Age fan geekery, but you don't have to be a history nerd to appreciate all of this. It practically makes the British Museum look like a jumble sale. So I had a focaccia, but half-eaten sandwiches are pretty unpleasant to look at on camera. So, okay, I had a Freddo espresso to celebrate. Had to take it easy for now, as the heat was getting unbearable. So iced coffee, time to sit and write, well, mostly this script, actually. Well, needing something a bit more to eat, and the lines here had been making me curious. So time to try some gyros from... yeah, there. Not sure what to do with that linguistically. It was good. I mean, the tzatziki tasted a bit zingy, the pork was good, and the fact it was just $3.90, and for a place that's so in demand, I mean, that's quite remarkable. I must say, in a blind test, I'm not sure I'd be able to pick it out from the lineup from the others I'd had this week, but it's definitely a tick for cost and quality. It was at this point I ran into a problem. I was due to be heading up the Acropolis, and I'd seen this coming on the weather apps, but of course at this stage, there's nothing I could do. Unlike every other site on the combined ticket, you have to lock in your Acropolis time slot at the point of booking. But as evening approached, the clouds came over, just blunting the colour. And I know this is not the same as rain. It's not stopping me from doing anything. But for a place this important, to have photos of it under radiant blue skies but no video was annoying. And I was going to have to rectify that at some point, and yet here was this irritating fluke whereby my only chance to see the Acropolis up close was this. It wasn't that dissimilar to October 2021, again, just without having to dodge raindrops. I will say, actually, the skies were giving me a bit more in terms of contrast. Looking back through the footage, it's not bad. It's just not what I was hoping for. I did feel kind of silly that I'd sort of missed my shot. I did get one thing that was kind of amazing. There are reports of potential storms rolling in, and you could see the rain happening off in the distance, and lightning behind the carotid porch. But, I was so conflicted. The Parthenon is such a famous monument all over the world. I wanted to soak in the excitement of being back here, but instead, I just felt kind of deflated and frustrated. Oh, and here's a low-angle flag shot, I guess. Kind of out of the habit of doing those. I did, in fact, have really great conversations with folks that night. Thankfully, the threatening clouds never materialised into anything more. Well, the third morning, I was up early and heading to the Athens train station, which is a bit out of the way, and it was out of town to somewhere very different. Once again, a story for another week. Yes, this week has 2 spin-off episodes. When I got back to Athens in the evening, I was determined this time I was actually going to make it up Lysibetis for sunset. So once again, I hoofed it across town. I would have filmed more of the surrounding neighbourhood, but I didn't want to jeopardise getting there in time. But as I was part way up, you could just see the sunset wasn't going to be all that. On an otherwise clear day, there was some cloud covering the horizon, so this colour was likely to be all there was to see. So I didn't really mind cutting my losses. This definitely is not going to be the last time I'm in Athens. It can wait. And I needed some dinner, which meant gyros. If you're keeping track, that means that yes, I had gyros all 4 nights, and I'm not remotely sorry. King move, if I'm honest. I don't have the budget to be eating really fancy, and no regrets about having any and all of these. So this gets us to the final morning. Got an early coffee island, and it's still great. I have a lot of affection for this. I was up and around in the early morning before the crowds and headed up the Pnyx. This is the hill facing the Acropolis, a place where the democratic assemblies of Athens would take place. Took some shots and generally took my time. Even if the Acropolis shots hadn't gone to plan, it still felt amazing to be back out in the world again. I know it had only been maybe ballpark a year that I'd been just continuously in the UK while Jen was pregnant and then having our son, but this summer turned out to be a really special one. At the tail end of the season, we were all in the Cyclades in Mykonos and Naxos with the whole family. Those episodes went up a little while ago. They are in the playlist. But as well, this summer was also a first and second time in Germany, with some time around the lakes in Switzerland and even getting down to Albania. So all of those are going to be coming up. Do hit the bell icon so you actually get a notification when these come out. It's been a rough 2026 for the channel so far. The platform has been throttling our reach such that no one's really seeing any of our stuff, which is very disheartening, to put it mildly. Okay, but before we leave Athens, we did have one more thing to do. I'd not done this archaeological park before, as you can pretty much see all of it from above when you just lean over the retaining wall of the Acropolis. One of the main features is the Theatre of Dionysus Eleuthereus, but there's other bits here as well. It was a pretty big queue to get in the morning, but it was the last thing on my combined ticket, and it's fine. I just had time to do this first thing before getting my flight early afternoon. So I was following the flow of people. This site is called the Slopes of the Acropolis, and it heads upwards. About the time we were level with the Theatre of Herodes Atticus, I realised that this section wasn't actually a loop. The whole park is unidirectional. It was nice to see all this, and a beautiful morning for it. But then something happened I wasn't expecting. rather than the path leading out of the area with the Acropolis, the path that would lead out was roped off, and instead the flow of people headed up and up the steps of the Acropolis. Now, I was a little nervous, like, am I going to be getting in trouble? But look, this is where everyone was heading, so I'm not arguing. And on this beautiful morning, there's the Parthenon, shining in the sun, blue skies behind. Yes! Again, this was not me trying to be cheeky or game the system or anything. I was not anticipating that the slopes park disgorged you right into the Parthenon again. Maybe someone's going to say, actually, no, that's not how it works. You have done a crime, actually. Well, clap me in irons and lock me in the cave known colloquially as Socrates' prison, which is undoubtedly no such thing. As you can no doubt tell, this had turned into a big win, getting to catch the Parthenon on this final and very beautiful morning. So having spent a bit more time getting footage, left with the biggest grin on my face. Now I could go home happy. And even then, the pleasant surprises were not over. The flight home afforded me some of the best aerial shots of the Adriatic I'd ever had. Having spent an above average amount of time on Google Earth over the years, trying to guess the landmass below is kind of my own personal geoguesser, but IRL. And there's certainly no mistaking the Karaburun Peninsula of Albania, where I'd be heading in just a few months. And then things like the Brioni Islands in Croatia. Go and watch the Pula and Istria episode. Just a massive treat. So this had really turned into a triumph, but as you gathered, there's a lot more to see coming very soon. Most of all, our episode from Aegina and the other day, which I won't spoil just yet, but please, 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 we've spent so much time curating this playlist of places all over Greece, whether it's our 4 episodes across Crete or Thessaloniki, or a cross-section of the Cycladic Islands. You can even watch the Ionian Island episodes and see what our episodes were like when we were just starting out and hadn't quite perfected audio ducking yet. And as ever, if you've enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support us, that's the place to do it. Also, if you catch us on Blue Sky, I mentioned these episodes are taking us quite a long time to cut together. On Blue Sky, we can be posting on more of a sort of week-by-week basis on what we're doing, so it's good to catch us there. And otherwise, yes, please hit the bell so you get notifications when new videos are up. Otherwise, we'll see you very soon.